Were slaves in America really bred for strength? And is that a reason why black athletes often dominate today? It's a common notion, and it's accepted as reality in many locker rooms and YouTube comments. In fact, the most popular video I ever produced is about why black athletes do so well in so many sports. I didn't include slavery as a factor, and I got a lot of comments behind what seems like a common sense explanation. Many people my age remember that in 1988, Jimmy the Greek, a popular CBS sports commentator, said out loud what a lot of people assumed was true. He said that black athletes were, quote, better to begin with because he's been bred to be that way. Because of his high thighs and big thighs, they can jump higher and run faster. The slave owner would breed his big black to his big woman so he could have a big black kid. That's where it all started. By the next day, Jimmy was out of a job, with CBS calling his comments reprehensible. But were they true? A lot of people believe it. A lot of black athletes certainly believe it. So the elephant in the room is this. Is that a reality or a myth? Hey, I'm Ken LaCourte. I researched this heavily, and I'll explain what I learned as straightforward as I can. We'll first take a look at the overall Atlantic global slave trade, because slaves had different lifestyles depending on where they landed. We'll focus on slavery in America for a very specific reason that will become clear, and then take a look at the myths versus realities of slave breeding and how it affected its descendants. So a good first question is to look at whether slaves were perhaps selected for or survived because of their strength. And we need to see how the global slave trade actually happened, because in many ways it was quite different from slavery that preceded it. Now, some people think slavery started with Africans, but that's nowhere close to reality. Slavery may have very well been America's original sin, but that can hide a cold reality. Slavery was humanity's default setting since basically forever. From ancient Sumerians and Vikings to Aztecs and Romans, the strong have enslaved the weak since the beginning of recorded history. If your clan or tribe lost a war against another, slavery was typical. So the Atlantic slave trade didn't invent slavery by any means, but it did industrialize it in a way the world had never seen. The numbers were massive, especially for the time. About 12 million Africans were forced onto slave ships between 1500 and 1867. And where did they come from? Mostly West Africa. Now, they weren't captured by European raiding parties snatching people from villages. They were captured through partnerships with African rulers, who sold virtually all of them. In fact, powerful kingdoms like the Dahomey, Ashanti, and the Yoruba states, they built entire empires on the backs of captives. In the 1840s, King Gezo of Dahomey didn't sugarcoat it. He called the slave trade, quote, the ruling principle of my people, the source and glory of their wealth. He added that even mothers sang lullabies about it. To put it in stark business terms, Europeans supplied the demand, transportation, and finance. African rulers ran the supply chain. It was an ugly partnership. But there wasn't much genetic selection going on at that stage. Africans sold rival tribesmen, prisoners, debtors, anyone they could grab. Sometimes they even launched wars for the express purpose of seizing people to sell. And those people ended up in coastal forts where European ships packed them in like cattle and set sail for the Americas. The journey was called the Middle Passage, and it was hell. People chained shoulder to shoulder, unable to stand, lying in their own waste for weeks. Nearly 2 million, about 1 in 7, died before they even reached the shore, with their bodies thrown overboard. But even here, the concept that only the strong survive is a pretty big oversimplification. The high death rate was largely caused by diseases like dysentery, smallpox, measles, or scurvy. Sometimes starvation, sometimes through the murder of those who resisted. Overall, luck, disease, and resilience played a lot larger role than inherent physical strength. Now, also, when Americans picture slavery, we usually think of cotton fields in the Deep South, of an American institution. But the United States was a relatively small player in the Atlantic slave trade, and it wasn't even close. Of those millions who were taken across the ocean, only about 3.5% actually landed in what would later become the United States. That's just 1 in 28. The rest were scattered across the Caribbean and South America, especially Brazil, which brought in about 4 to 5 million Africans, about 10 times more than the United States. But a later number jumps out of the statistics. By 1825, America didn't just still have 3.5% of the Western slaves. It had about 25%. That's because, over the years, the U.S. slave population grew, while in most of the rest of the world, it dropped. Why? Because of the ugly economics of slavery and death. Being a slave in America, it's difficult to even imagine. But the Caribbean and Brazilian plantations, they devoured human lives. Brutal workloads, diseases like malaria, yellow fever, horrific living conditions. That meant death rates of up to 5% every year. To keep production rolling, plantation owners continuously brought in new slaves, turning sugar and coffee plantations into literal killing fields. Their financial accounting was brutal. Don't raise a family, just buy a new person when one dies. In contrast, the United States became unique in the world of having a slave population that grew through reproduction, and that's a backdrop for everything that comes next. When the United States banned the importation of new slaves in 1808, you might think it would be the beginning of the end of American slavery, but in reality, it transformed it into something darker. With the external supply cut off, slaveholders turned inward, recognizing that enslaved women's fertility was essential to their future. To them, it was clear. The bodies of slave women now held far more value than their labor alone. Even Thomas Jefferson, a man who kept meticulous records, laid it out plainly. He wrote that a woman who bore a child every 2 years was more profitable than the best laboring man. Jefferson instructed the overseers not to overwork pregnant women in their final months. It wasn't kindness, it was cold economic logic aimed at protecting his investment. And Jefferson wasn't alone by a long shot. Across plantations, owners openly acknowledged and understood the financial incentives of encouraging birth. Slave traders would even advertise a woman's past pregnancies as a selling point. The Upper South, places like Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, as their soil got worn out from tobacco, they still had people who could be sold. By the 1930s, Virginia alone was shipping out tens of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children each year to the cotton fields of the Deep South. Slaveholders began encouraging reproduction in ways that blurred the line between manipulation and force. Some offered small incentives, extra food, lighter workloads, even promises of family stability to women who bore more children. Others intervened more directly. They chose partners, they played matchmaker, they demanded results. But while these practices were real and horrifying, they weren't uniform. Not every slave owner forced pairings. Many allowed marriages or informal unions, and many enslaved people chose their own partners when possible. Slave weddings, jumping the broom, or ring shout ceremonies. They offered some sliver of dignity inside a system designed to erase it. And while some owners leaned on carrots, keep your family together, get a few extra scraps, others relied on sticks. Refuse to cooperate, get sold. Don't produce enough children, go back to the fields, or worse. For many women, reproductive value became their worth. Now, and some resisted. There are accounts of enslaved women secretly using cotton root as a contraceptive, or practicing prolonged breastfeeding to suppress ovulation. Others sought abortions, or even infanticide to avoid bringing another child into bondage. This resistance, it's not really talked about a lot, but it speaks to the truth behind the myth. Yes, reproduction was encouraged, even coerced. Yes, women were valued as breeders and men as studs. But what slaveholders wanted and what actually happened, that wasn't always the same thing. Hey, if I make any mistakes here, I'll correct it in a pinned comment below. I also have my script notes and sources linked in the description. And if you're getting something useful here, now's a good time to subscribe. Okay, so now we're at the heart of the question. The idea that American slave owners systematically bred their slaves like livestock to create stronger or faster human beings, intentionally or accidentally. It's not just a Jimmy the Greek theory, but one that's common among athletes as well, including Olympian Michael Johnson, who said that, quote, "All my life, I believed that I became an athlete through my own determination. But it's impossible to think that being descended from slaves hasn't left an imprint through generations. Difficult as it was to hear, slavery has benefited descendants like me. I believe there is a superior athletic gene in us." So slave breeding was certainly encouraged and even forced. But was it systematic and scientific? Historians have searched for hard evidence of organized slave breeding programs with selective mating or genetic planning, and they found very little. They certainly did uncover individual cases of brutal forced pairings, though. William Wells Brown, a former slave, he vividly recalled a Kentucky plantation that had a breeding man named Big Bill who was set around to impregnate women. Another former slave, Henry Blake, described how plantation owners studied enslaved black men like horses, confining them with healthy women to produce strong offspring. These narratives weren't isolated, but they weren't exactly eugenics either. There was no multi-generation breeding plan. Their goal was simple. More babies meant more money. Historians have spent decades combing through plantation records, census data, personal letters, sales logs, you name it, looking for evidence of a more widespread or an intentional breeding program. What they found? essentially nothing. Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman, the economists behind Time on the Cross, they were clear. They found very meager evidence of systemic breeding. In fact, when owners did try to meddle in slave families by forcing breedings or breaking up relationships, it often backfired, leading to fewer births, not more. Turns out emotional stress and forced sex, it's not necessarily the greatest fertility booster. So to be clear, forced reproduction absolutely happened. Slaveholders raped women. Some selected strong men to father children, but that's not the same thing as eugenics. There was no science, even accidentally. There was no consistency, no coordination. And here's another key point. Real selective breeding, the kind that produces stronger babies, requires control and, more importantly, scale. American slave owners mostly didn't have that. By 1860, over half of them owned fewer than 5 slaves. You can't run a eugenics program when you only have one woman of childbearing age. And even on large plantations, the logistics just didn't support it. And slave owners weren't even trying to pass along strength or stamina. They just wanted more people to sell or work on their farm. Any baby would do, and whether that child could someday win a sprint or even be a stronger worker was largely irrelevant. And in fact, sometimes the opposite happened. A strong teen boy might be sold downriver the moment he hit puberty, not kept around to father future kids. Prime young men were too valuable as labor to waste as studs. As historian David Breon Davis put it, whatever selective breeding occurred under slavery was sporadic and unsystematic. It left no discernible genetic legacy distinct from the slave's African ancestry. That last part is key. The traits that do help in athletics, like fast-twitch muscle fiber or leg-to-torso ratio, those already existed in African populations long before slavery. West Africa, where most American slaves came from, they've long been home to sprinters, jumpers, and power athletes. The raw material was already there. And today, modern genetic testing shows that African Americans, on average, are about 80% West or Central African and about 20% European in ancestry. There's no slave gene, no unique super strain or evidence of new breeds of humans forged in the American South. It's the same genetic diversity that exists in Africans worldwide. So why does the myth persist? Part of it is convenience. It offers up a tidy, biologically deterministic explanation for why black athletes shine so much. It flattens a complex mix of culture, economics, and opportunity into one sexy phrase. They were bred for it. It can also reduce achievement to ancestry. I mean, that Johnson quote was kind of sad. It can tell a black athlete that his success isn't really his and that some of it belongs to a boss man from years ago. And it also misses how much black excellence in sports is social, not biological. In the 1950s, they said blacks weren't smart enough to be quarterbacks. In the 60s, they said they didn't have the mental toughness for tennis. Then Arthur Ashe won Wimbledon. Doug Williams won the Super Bowl. Serena and Venus blew the doors off of the tennis establishment. None of that had anything to do with slave-era breeding. There might be some genetics involved, but it mainly had to do with talent, discipline, grit, and finally more access. Ultimately, the reality is this. Slaveholders exploited enslaved people's reductive capacity for profit. That generated more slaves, but not a genetically engineered group of people. Okay, so let's lighten this up a little bit. We'll go from a myth to something that's actually been proven by statistics. Overall, black men do indeed love big butts. Other group of men do as well, but not nearly as much. The big question? Why? And why do other ethnic groups go for the smaller ones, including me? I found some fascinating historical and scientific answers. Hey, thanks for watching. If you learned something here, come back again.